Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. So today we're going to be updating the Meeting Drac section, since we've already done the Portsmouth tour, but now I'm going to give everyone a chance to have a voice on where the next tour is going to be. So since there's not an inbuilt polling option on Squarespace, I'm kind of creating one of my own. As you can see here, I'm using the events section, which comes in this particular format, prepackaged with 3 events on there. And I'm retitling it as Upcoming Tours Expressions of Interest, and obviously going Portsmouth Historic Dockyard again. And I'm also going to include Chatham and HMS Belfast, and then you'll see in a second I'm just going to edit the button down there and give it the email and then a default title. So then if you go to the section of the website, if you want to come and have a guided tour around one of these 3 places, then all you have to do is go and click on that. It'll generate an email, and all you have to do is just hit send. You don't have to add anything else to the body of the message. And then I can count up how many emails I have voting for each place, and that'll dictate to a certain degree where the next tour in early 2024 will take place. It's quite easy to set up, actually. I'm very surprised. Anyway, so if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. So today we have a little bit of a different way of doing things on the channel. Now, first of all, I need to introduce you to a rather special guest. We've had, obviously, various authors on before, and today is, to a certain degree, no different. I'm glad to introduce the work of Robert Lundgren to you. Now, of course, I imagine a few of you will probably already be familiar with his excellent work. He's written a couple of books: The World Wondered, What Really Happened Off Samar, and Battleship Victory, both well worth picking up on, and a lot of other work that he's done, including an analysis of USS Nevada's performance off of Normandy on D-Day, and perhaps one of the things everyone's hopefully rarely familiar with, a very thorough analysis of the action between Washington and South Dakota against Kirishima and friends, including a precise analysis of what happened to Kirishima and what happened to South Dakota in terms of damage. Those can all be found on the NavWeps website. There'll be a specific link in the video description below. Now, more recently, Mr. Lundgren has very kindly performed a in-depth, incredibly detailed analysis of what immediately preceded that action. So the action between Admiral Callaghan's cruiser force and Hiei Kirishima and their escorts. The full document is well over 120 pages long and can be found at the link, as I said, in the video description below. However, in the interest of not having to go through 120 pages of documentation in a video, although I have read through the report quite extensively, I think about 6 times already, I thought it would be best to conduct an interview with Mr. Lundgren and also with Mr. Sposato, who kind of prompted Mr. Lundgren to actually do the analysis and I believe helped him out to a certain degree. So, normally, of course, you would be seeing either a Skype or Zoom conversation going on with pictures, as we've done with numerous other authors. However, neither of the gentlemen in question were able to do a direct interview, and so instead, they were kind enough to submit written responses to the questions that I asked. But, of course, this runs into a little bit of a problem because my American accents could best be described as stereotypical and get progressively worse from there. And I have no idea how I'd be able to hold even a half-decent American accent, let alone 2, for half an hour plus. And so we agreed that, rather uniquely, what we're going to be doing is I'm going to be doing the questions as per how I would normally do an interview, but their responses, which have been sent via text, are going to be read out by a text-to-speech AI with different voices for the 2 individuals. So Mr. Lundgren's responses will always be first, followed by Mr. Sposato's, where he chose to respond to the questions, because obviously it's primarily talking with Mr. Lundgren as the one who wrote the report. Hopefully it's interesting for everybody. And don't worry, this doesn't mean the channel's going to become a voice AI channel. This is essentially just using modern technology to square a particular circle of this particular problem that we have. So, with that said, on with the questions. So, with relation to the first major naval night action of Guadalcanal, historically speaking, what gaps have there been in the narrative of this battle?
In many documentaries, this battle is described as a Pier 6 brawl. Many survivors claim that once the shooting started, everyone was shooting at anything that moved. Yet surprisingly, there are no real details other than San Francisco hitting Atlanta usually mentioned. However, with this analysis, Atlanta was not only hit by San Francisco, but Portland as well, and then hit again by Monson. Lafay was sunk by Sterett. Sterett and Helena also hit and cripple Aaron Ward. Helena strafes Portland with her 40mm guns and fired into Monson. And I believe Fletcher torpedoed Portland. To end it all, Harusame likely crippled Udachi. So there was a lot of chaos in this battle. I believe this analysis starts to provide the details of what the survivors meant by a Pier 6 brawl. Hara, captain of Amatsukaze. On the Japanese side, on why Abe hesitated in opening fire paints, a picture similar to Midway, that Hiei's crew was busy trying to switch from Type 3 ammunition to AP ammunition. And this has never made sense to me. That is not how battleships work. So, the Midway analogy of the carriers getting caught, attempting to rearm their aircraft, never worked for me. I believe the reason Abe hesitated was he did not know where the other Japanese ships were, and was afraid of opening fire on his own ships, and this is a far better reason for his delay. As for Callaghan, he lost tactical awareness. He was capping the T in classic naval procedure of the two southern columns, but became confused when his own column was capped by the most northern Japanese group. This confusion allowed both fleets to basically collide with each other.
There may be some answers to this question that show up later on, but I kept them in context to those instead. This battle represents the IJN's last best attempt to shut down Henderson Airfield. For all the planning they have done to accomplish this all goes to waste when the USN has to act immediately and with very little time to coordinate a proper response. This is one of the few battles where the Americans are beaten, but don't let the Japanese get anything out it. You can tell that this was not a well-developed plan since Admiral Callaghan doesn't seem to relay his intentions to many other ships, perhaps because he realizes what must be done, and telling others will make that harder to accomplish. He is often seen as a fool, but that's what 80 years of not knowing these details has done. Everyone holding an overall command at this battle will be axed if they were not killed, with two exceptions being Hara and DeBose, the captain of Portland. Lost in the narrative are the effectiveness of USN torpedoes, but also how well or not they were used. For anyone surprised about the Fletcher hitting Portland, just remember the event between William Porter and Iowa. As Lundgren will mention, this is the crucible by which the USN becomes a well-tuned fighting force that Japan cannot beat. This was where and when the IJN come the closest to deploying their Kentai-Kessen strategy in 1942, and the USN still holds them off by throwing cruisers at battle cruisers. This was the turning point in the Pacific War. Admiral Lee will see to the completion of that turn.
Given the large number of ships involved, and as you both mentioned, the sheer confusion of what was going on in this battle, what was the motivation behind taking all of these reports and then trying to make sense of them?
I had no plans to write on this subject. Frank Sposato contacted me and asked for help. This paper is largely for Frank, and if he is happy with it, so am I. I applied the same methodology to this battle that I had applied for the battleship action and the naval battle of Samar, and plotted each ship's position in 1-minute intervals. Once this was completed, I had a much better understanding of where everyone was in relation to each other.
My initial motivation for trying to understand the events of this battle was by reading about the USS Portland in a book called Sweet Pea at War. The author claimed that this ship was responsible for putting the shots into the IJN Hiei that disabled her steering. I have had a personal interest in learning more about the Portland due to her extensive war service that never gets the appropriate attention. She is the only warship to have fought directly in all 4 carrier battles, as well as both battleship actions, even though she was only present at Tulagi, but had her guns trained out to sea in case anyone got close. However, before wanting to learn more about this ship, I had always been surprised that this battle has never received a proper track chart like all the other naval fights in this war. For at least a decade, I have wanted to know, and only after getting in contact with a friend of Lundgren's was I able to start figuring this out with him. I was inspired by his previous book about the Battle of Samar, where, using his minute-by-minute retracing of the battle, he discovered that Yamato fired the shots that hit the Johnston. At no point would I have believed that the commonly accepted narrative of this battle have been so wrong. A lot of this began when reading James Grace's book on this battle. There I began to see and understand it much better. Another concern for me was the name given to this action. The first naval battle of Guadalcanal is sorely insufficient and becomes far more confusing when first is used, and this is technically the third engagement. By naming it the Naval Battle for Henderson Airfield Night 1, we clarify that this is the part of the Guadalcanal campaign where the IJN is looking to finish off the airfield that has caused them so much pain, this time by sea. Just like how you broke up the Narvik battle into 3 separate fights, I see this one the same way, although it needs to be understood that the battleship duel then becomes the third night, since there was also an attempt by IJN cruisers to hit the airfield in between both actions.
So, having decided that you're going to do this analysis, how long did it actually take, and did you discover any new sources along the way?
At least 2 years. The newest source material is a film of the actual wrecks. I did not initially have all the film of Hiei. I worked with Park Stevenson and Victor Vescovo on finding the wrecks of USS Johnston and USS Samuel B. Roberts, along with author Anthony Tully. Parks did a documentary with Lone Wolf Media, which now owns the film of the wrecks, and eventually I was able to see all the film of Hiei's wreck. I then applied the same analysis I did of her wreck that Anthony and I did for Kirishima. For me, the wrecks tell a story if you are willing to listen and allow them to speak. Many of their signs are very subtle: a bent propeller blade, a deformed side, sheared-off bolts to a propeller shaft, a bent rudder forward of the rudder post, and a crushed-in keel together are all signs of an under-keel detonation. The other aspect is attempting to match up damage that is visible with the reports to confirm what is in the reports.
For more than a decade, I have been particularly bothered by the lack of certain details in this battle, and was always confused with how that had happened since every battle is so well covered by comparison. The sources I used over the time I have been trying to piece this battle together began with Enterprise 360 and Hornfischer's Neptune's Inferno, Mark Stillis Osprey publishing book on the battle, Thomas Generous's Sweet Pea at War, and most importantly James Grace's book, The Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. Tamichi Hara's reference was also helpful, but the problem was always trying to put together someone else retelling from what they had learned. All of the contradictions between these sources concerned me, that there was this 50-minute gap of critical naval history that has been completely overlooked. This action's confusing, close-handed nature at night, with the potential of cover-ups taking place all the while. Everyone just wants to get to the part where the battleships duke it out, may have contributed to this historical oversight.
Speaking of oversights, how many gaps were left in particular ship records, and how did you fill those in based on the records that were available from other vessels?
The biggest gaps remain on the Japanese side, as I could not locate very much primary data and had to use secondary sources. There are certain observations, such as Juno reported the first torpedo hit on her port side, yet the ship that currently claims to have hit her was a Matsukaze on her starboard side. I lack primary data on Ikazuchi and Inazuma, but if they had fired more torpedoes, Juno may have been hit by one of these ships and not Amatsukaze, as most records now tell. However, without that data, I also felt obliged to stay with the current narrative and give credit to Amatsukaze.
Picking up on that, what are the main contradictions between records and sources that you've had to deal with?
The biggest contradiction was Portland actually hit at 0158 by a torpedo. Or was she hit around 02-0222, which I believe to be the case? I don't think Udachi, who makes the claim she hit Portland at 0158, could reload and fire more 8 torpedoes in 3 minutes. Hara reported it typically required 10 minutes to reload the torpedoes, and I feel that is more reasonable. Secondly, Portland could still maneuver, and Helena falls in behind her at 0214, and both ships are steering east. This is inconsistent with her damage, so if she was hit at 0158, she should have been immediately disabled at that point. Then Fletcher fires 10 torpedoes and I believe accidentally hits Portland around 0222, but because Portland's report claims she was hit at 0158, this has been the narrative. I think she placed this in her report to cover up friendly fire by Fletcher. And it worked. For 70 years it has been covered up. Why was this covered up? The number of friendly fire incidents is significant. Then, the 5 Sullivan brothers are killed in this battle. The Navy did not want it getting out to the home front. They were shooting at each other, and families' children were getting killed by their own comrades. I understand the confusion of a night battle, and don't look at the issue attempting to lay blame on anyone, but simply report what I believe actually occurred. The errors made in 1942 for the most part helped the Navy win the battles of 1943, 1945. Now keep in mind Nimitz placed 3 surface warfare officers in charge of developing the PAC-10 directives due to the mistakes made in the 1942 battles. More and more men were coming into the fleet, and many had never even seen the ocean before. The need for training versus the need to conduct the war meant that officers could not be relied on to make their own battle plans, as none of the various officers had ever worked together, and this issue was only going to be compounded by the expansion of the fleet. The PAC-10 directives gave commanders clear instructions so that a commander could give orders, and everyone understood what was expected. A carrier-centric fleet could transform into a surface-centric fleet with minimal instructions. So, the errors in the 1942 battles off Guadalcanal helped win the battles of 1943, 1945. The Japanese, on the other hand, really don't learn and continue to make similar errors later in the war. They really liked their Type 3 ammunition, and I feel this ammunition was a greater threat to the ships that carry it than to U.S. forces. The Marines on Guadalcanal felt the Type 3 ammunition was a sideshow. What really affected them was the conventional Type O HC shells that cratered the runway and put the Marines themselves in shock. Had the Japanese loaded conventional HC projectiles, they would have done more damage to the U.S. fleet. But Kirishima makes the identical mistake 2 nights later during the battleship action and is initially loaded with the wrong ammunition for a surface engagement.
The biggest contradictions that I was concerned with were the positions of the IJN Nagara and Udachi. Before talking to Lundgren, my understandings about this battle had these ships in multi-places at once and shooting at different targets that don't make sense in range bearing and time of their locations. One other very important detail that needs to be understood: the only way that people have talked about this battle for 80 years was by referring to ships individually. The inherent problem with this laid itself bare when trying to match up their records and movements. Not all ships had their times synchronized. Lundgren noticed that ships were sometimes as much as 20 minutes off. Too many have taken for granted certain details without putting them together coherently.
So in this work, what are the biggest surprises that you came across when it came to sorting out this battle?
The number of friendly fire incidents. I believe there are 11 on the U.S. side and 1 on the Japanese side.
I probably answered this in other places, but defiantly, the amount of friendly fire. Captain Hoover will call out a ceasefire immediately after Portland is hit by torpedoes around 0225.
Now, of course, we do encourage everybody who can to read the full document that's been written about this battle now, which, as I said, can be found in the link below. But for those of you who are just looking for an immediate summary right now, how do your findings change some of the commonly accepted elements of the battle?
U.S. destroyer torpedoes and all U.S. torpedoes at this time period were unreliable. Most accounts have U.S. destroyer torpedoes bouncing off He's hull, and they did in the case of Cushing's torpedoes because they were fired at to close a range. O'Bannon, Monson, and Starrett, however, did hit He with at least 6 torpedoes that exploded, and at least 3 of these detonations are preserved in her hull. I also believe this is why the wreck broke apart. In order for the wreck to break up, her sides had to be severely compromised. However, when the article was first put up, the discussion that resulted provided a possibility that U.S. torpedoes may have been detonating slightly prematurely due to their magnetic fuse. This may explain why Hiei was able to absorb so many U.S. torpedoes. Yet, later in the war, Congo was sunk by 2.
So, keeping that in mind, which ships turn out to have had the most different battle compared to previous accounts of this action?
I focused on Hiei, so I hope her story is better understood.
Other than what Lundgren has said about the Hiei, for me the Portland has been the most critical to learn about. She plays an important role in this fight, even when she unfortunately hits the Atlanta with multiple salvos. She still puts rounds into the Hiei, although not the critical hits to steering as delivered by the San Fran. Taking what may have been up to 3 USN torpedoes to her stern becomes very apparent when you study the damage charts made public online that show a more narrow area of destruction from a single IJN torpedo, Northampton is a good example, versus multiple USN torps that hit Portland. This makes her quite lucky to have survived such damage. The irony to this situation is that this allows her the next morning to sink Udachi while the Japanese are still trying to extract the Hiei. But most importantly, the Portland becomes the HQ of first responders by picking up the surviving crews of the sunken ships and even the Atlanta crew. The other ships I would like to highlight are many of the American destroyers. While the green crews aboard the Fletcher made an unfortunate mistake with their torpedoes, the O'Bannon, the Sterrett, and Monson all made important contributions to this battle by getting hits on an enemy battleship. The time and location of these hits are spread out enough that Hiei's crew contained the damage below, while at the same time dealing with the fires above delivered by Laffey and Cushing. There are still some gaps that need closing, such as what Juno and Yukikaze did during the battle, but these may be lost to time and later events. I do find it interesting that this is the first fight that Fletchers get into, and again, the Yukikaze's curse befalls the IJN here as well.
So with 2 books, the Kirishima analysis and this one, under your belt, what other narratives have you done or are you planning to do?
This article and the latest article on the Nevada at Normandy are likely my last attempts at writing U.S. naval history.
This would be my first. I would someday like to tell the story of the Java Ghost Fleet that tries to escape after the Langley was sunk. I also would like to tell the story of 2 competing auxiliaries that were sunk in the Solomons while delivering troops and equipment directly to the battlefield, the USS Macaulay and IJN Nishin.
And finally, what are the best places for people to catch up on and read your full body of work, Mr. Lundgren?
At Tony DeJulian's website navweeps.com under Robert Lundgren Historical Resources, I have several articles including The Naval Battle for Henderson Airfield First Night, The Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, which is on the Battleship Action, Analysis of the Wreck of Kirishima, Analysis of Damage to USS South Dakota at the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, USS Nevada from June 6 to June 15, 1944, off Normandy, France, Utah Beach. Part 1 and Part 2 are completed. Part 3 will soon be completed. I have written 2 books, The World Wondered on the Naval Battle of Samar, Battleship Victory that covers the Pacific Campaign in WW2.
Well, thank you very much to both of you for submitting the written answers to the questions and agreeing to do so that we could put this video together. Obviously, those of you who have just listened through will realise that whilst voice AI has come a fair way in the last 5 years, there are a few pronunciation errors and so forth that it still needs to overcome, which is comforting for those of us who rely on our voices to transmit information as part of our day-to-day living. But with that, it's time to wrap up this video, other than to obviously once again reiterate, if you want to read the full analysis of this particular fight, then the link is once again in the description below, and of course you can pick up Battleship Victory and The World Wondered, What Happened Off Samar from all good bookshops. Again, links below. And thanks very much for everyone for bearing with us in this little experiment of how to bring voices alive when they are just in text.